Thank you very much for the opportunity to present my work to you today. I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to your conference. I'm very honored to share my work with you at this prestigious event. I work at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. This is a laboratory of the United States Department of Energy. We are located in the San Francisco Bay Area. We are located behind the University of California, Berkeley campus. You can see the view from my laboratory looking down at the campus and across the bay to San Francisco in the virtual background behind my screen. In fact, we look through the Golden Gate to Asia every day from our vantage point on the hill behind the UC campus. Today, I'm going to talk about the frequency control requirements for reliable interconnection frequency response. The management of power system frequency is an essential requirement for the reliable operation of power systems. It must be managed on a continuous basis every second of the day and year. The most challenging time for frequency management is when there is a sudden loss of a generator or a large transmission line, which creates a large imbalance between the generation and the load at any given time. And it's the collective capability of the remaining generators and or loads that are still connected to the grid that are required to restore the system frequency very quickly, otherwise a blackout will ensue. This phenomena, this feature of power system restoration is called frequency response and is the focus of my comments today. The work that I'll be describing was commissioned by the United States Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 2005 after the 2003 Northeast blackout, which resulted in a blackout that affected 50 million customers in both the United States and in Canada. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was given authority to enforce mandatory reliability standards for the operation of the global power system. This study was prepared as a technical assessment to help guide future standards that will address frequency response and frequency control. It's actually the second of two reports that we've prepared for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The first report developed new metrics to measure the adequacy of frequency response, and it touched very specifically on the issues raised by the introduction of variable renewable generation. The work that I'll be presenting tonight builds on that earlier study, but extends it to address in a holistic fashion all the issues that are raised for frequency response that result from the changing composition of the generation fleet. And so it is a more general discussion about the circumstances that lead to frequency control requirements and the way in which they are provided by generators. This talk will have essentially two parts. I will spend the first part of my remarks introducing the concepts of system frequency and frequency control, and in particular the requirements for frequency response. I will then summarize some of the findings from our study, looking at the requirements for reliable frequency response, and then discuss some of the recommendations. To summarize very quickly, rapidly deployed and then sustained primary frequency control actions are required to respond to the sudden loss of generation in order to maintain reliability. This requirement is met by the action of turbine governors, in some cases by fast demand response and inverter-based sources. There are two aspects of having adequate interconnection frequency response. One is the interconnection policies, which determine the requirements of the fleet, and specifically whether the generators that are online are equipped to provide and sustain primary frequency response. The second is generation dispatch policies. These policies will determine how much frequency response can be delivered, and the amount that is required depends on the size of the generation loss event that the interconnection is designed to withstand. It will also determine the speed with which primary frequency response will be deployed, and that depends on the types of units that are dispatched and the headroom that is assigned to them. Headroom refers to the difference between a generator's current operating point and its maximum capability. It's sort of the amount that it can increase its output on a very rapid basis. So let me introduce these frequency control concepts. Power system frequency reflects the balance between generation and load on a continuous basis. I like to use the analogy of a vessel of water that has water both flowing in and out of it as simultaneously. The water flowing in can be thought of as generation. The water flowing out can be thought as the load that is placed on the system. When the inflow equals the outflow, then the level of water in the vessel is stable. And in the analogies that frequency is kept constant. In North America, that is 60 hertz or 60 cycles per second. When the outflow is less than the inflow, frequency rises above 60 cycles. When the inflow is less than the outflow,
올라가게 됩니다. 이렇게 되면은 이러한
when the inflow is less than the outflow, and frequency will fall below 60 cycles. During normal operations, looking at the lower panel, frequency is managed between very tight boundaries around the target frequency of 60 cycles in North America. The period that we'll be talking about is following the sudden loss of generation when there is a dramatic imbalance between load and generation, and frequency control actions are required to restore frequency to 60 cycles. If those actions are unsuccessful, then more drastic steps must be taken to maintain reliability. The first of those and the last of those, in fact, is under-frequency load shedding, which refers to the deliberate shedding of large blocks of load in a last-ditch effort to restore frequency to a safe operating level. If those actions are unsuccessful, generators will begin to take themselves offline through automatic protections, and a blackout will ensue. It is essential that the frequency control actions prevent frequency from falling to the point at which under-frequency load shedding is triggered, and of course to prevent generators from tripping so they can remain online and restore frequency and keep the lights on. This set of panels describes the evolution of a frequency response event. On the top panel, I'm showing frequency and the evolution of frequency in two different time periods. The first is the very short time period of 30 seconds. So when a generator goes offline due to an equipment failure, frequency falls precipitously and to a low point, and this is what needs to be arrested. The frequency is arrested by the actions of primary frequency control resources. This is shown on the lower panel. The principal source of primary frequency control is governor response of turbine generators, and I'll focus quite a bit of my remarks on the actions that require these turbine generators. But it can also be provided by frequency response of demand response, and if there's time in the discussion, we may want to touch on those topics as well. The injection of primary frequency control, the injection of power from primary frequency control resources arrests frequency at what we call the frequency nadir, which I'm showing in the transition between the blue and the yellow shading. And frequency would then rebound and become stable for a short period of time. At that point, slower forms of frequency control, principally secondary frequency control, will be employed to restore frequency to its nominal value. Secondary frequency control is provided by generators that are on automatic generator control. These are dispatched commands that are sent out every 4 to 10 seconds by a control center, instructing generators to increase their output. Finally, after frequency has been restored to the target level, tertiary frequency control is exercised through the redispatch of generation. And what you can see is that as secondary resources come online and start restoring frequency, the primary resources back off and restore their reserves, and so they can act in it if there's a subsequent event. Similarly, the actions of tertiary frequency control restore the reserves of secondary frequency control. So you have this sequence of responses that are on different time frames, each seeking to relieve the other one in order to prepare this power system for another event that might cause them to be required. Let me talk now about this period specifically. This is the period of great interest to us, how fast frequency is falling, and therefore how must the primary frequency controls react in order to arrest this frequency before this under-frequency load shedding point is reached. I'm going to again use the analogy of a vessel of water. It's been expanded somewhat. There are two primary concepts that are involved. One is the inertia of the power system, and the second is the size of the generation loss event that the interconnection must be designed to withstand. They must be considered together. They cannot be considered independently. Now I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In the left-hand panel, I'm comparing two different power systems, one with low inertia and one with high inertia. And I'm turning off the faucet, the generation, an identical amount of generation in both instances at the same time. After a period of time, one will find that in the system with high inertia, frequency has fallen less than it has fallen in a system with low inertia. So this is why there is a lot of discussion, and we'll talk more about this, about low inertia systems and the problems of frequency control when the system inertia is much lower than it has been historically. But I want to emphasize that that's only half of the story. The other half of the story that needs to be considered is the size of the generation loss event. In this example, I'm looking at systems that all have the same amount of inertia, but the amount of generation loss is doubled on the right-hand side of the left panel and the right panel. So for a given loss of generation, for a larger loss of generation, frequency will fall faster over a given period of time than it will for a smaller loss of generation. So these factors together interact to determine how quickly frequency will fall and therefore how fast primary frequency control resources must act. Let me continue now and relate this to some of the things that we're seeing in the changes in the resource mix. This is a way of expressing the inertia of the generators that are online. The system inertia of a power system is the combined inertia of every connected generator at its operating point. And what you see here is that the technologies, the turbine governor technologies that are used to generate electricity vary in their inertia. And what you have here are essentially steam plants in the middle, steam turbine plants with inertias of between 2 and 3 and up to 4. And then you have combustion turbines and combined cycle plants, which have very high inertia. And then you have wind and solar here on the right. And so a lot of the discussion and concern about system inertia are folks who talk about if we replace all these steam turbine plants, coal in particular, with the units that have zero inertia, we're going to lower system inertia and we're going to have much more greater frequency control problems. That is true to a degree, but it must be taken in the context of this generation loss, and I will explain that separately. But it's also the case that as in my country, as coal plants are retired, they're being replaced with combined cycle plants primarily. And so you could have instances in which you retire a lot of coal and lose a lot of inertia from that, but you're actually increasing inertia because you're replacing with a higher inertia resource. And this has been seen in Texas. Texas is the interconnection in the United States with the highest penetration of wind power and the highest retirement of coal-fired generation. But as a result of the introduction of a lot of combined cycle units, the system inertia in Texas has actually increased slightly, even though there's quite a bit of resources in there that have zero inertia. So it is the system weighted average of the combined inertias of all power plants that are generating and online that determines system inertia. The second factor that is very important to consider is the size of the generation loss event. And here I'm looking at the 3 interconnections in the United States. And what I'm first showing is the size of the generation loss event that each interconnection is designed to withstand. And then I'm contrasting that with the size of the interconnections. They're vastly different sizes. So the generation loss event is typically defined by the loss of a very, very large power plant. But the size of the interconnections, of course, varies tremendously. And the worst case situation is when the power system is at minimum, not at peak load, but when the system is at minimum load, because then the ratio between the size of the generation loss event and the overall size of the amount of load that's being served by the interconnection is at its lowest. And so here you see a couple of very interesting things. The largest generation loss event that is designed to is for the eastern interconnection. But because it is the largest interconnection, even at min load, this event only represents a 2% loss of generation with respect to the size of that interconnection. In contrast, over here in the Texas interconnection, because this interconnection is much smaller at the time of minimum load, this generation loss event, which is again a single power plant, represents a very, very large proportion of that load, of the load in that system, and therefore the frequency response concern is much greater. So again, I want to emphasize both the inertia of the power system and the generation loss event that need to be taken into consideration. Here are some charts that relate the two to one another. On the right-hand chart, I'm showing the effective system inertia constant of the power system as a whole. 3 and 4 are very typical values. And then I'm looking at a 2% generation loss event. And for that event, the system that has the higher inertia will have, going to this left panel, the slower rate of change. The frequency will fall slower and not as fast as it does in the lower system inertia power system. So this is a system that has 3 and 4, and you can see that the frequency is falling much faster in the system that has the lower inertia. And that is the concern that people have of loss of inertia in a power system, that frequency will fall too fast and faster than the primary frequency response resources can respond. So those are the requirements that I'll be talking about in my remarks here to follow. Let me just illustrate this again in another way. Now I'm looking at 2 different generation loss events. One is 2% and one is 4% with 2 different system inertias. One is 3 and 4. And so here I'm trying to show that a very large change in system inertia from 3 to 4 seconds still results in very minimal changes in the nadir, the lowest frequency that is reached in this frequency response event for a given size of generation, much lower, and that the effect of the size of the generation loss event is a much bigger impact in terms of how fast frequency falls and how much primary frequency control must be exerted, despite these changes in system inertia. So again, trying to put into perspective that is both this change in system inertia that needs to be understood, as well as this design loss of generation event that the interconnection is designed to withstand. So with that, I'm going to turn to some of the findings. The first finding is really that a very simple one, which is frequency will be arrested when the amount of primary frequency response that is delivered is equal to the amount of generation that has been lost. And so here's, again, the same example that I showed earlier on a different scale. These are 2 different inertia constants. Frequency is falling faster, as I've just explained, when the system has lower inertia than it does when the system has higher inertia. Frequency is arrested these are the nadir points here, when the amount of primary frequency response injected is equal to the generation loss, which is 2% in this example. So the first finding really is that the reserves that are being held to provide primary frequency control must exceed the expected loss of generation. If these reserves are not here and able to deliver this much power, frequency will not be arrested, frequency will fall, under frequency load shedding will be triggered, and it is highly likely that a blackout will ensue. The second finding is that, it should be obvious from these pictures, is that primary frequency response must be delivered quickly. And the way that it can be delivered most quickly is to have many generators, each individually contributing a small amount very rapidly, so that the total amount that is delivered over a short period of time is adequate to arrest frequency before the nadir crosses the under frequency load shedding threshold. What I'm showing here is that each each type of turbine generator has a different response due to its electromechanical properties. So steam turbines take some amount of time to ramp up their primary frequency response. Combined cycle gas engines, principally because of the gas turbines that they contain, can ramp up very quickly. Hydro, in fact, sees a short depression initially in its output when frequency is depressed, but then slowly increases its output. So the speed characteristics of each type of generator design must be taken into account in determining how fast primary frequency response can be provided. The recommendation that I'll talk about later, and one that was adopted by FERC as a result of our study, is that all new generators in the United States, as a condition of interconnection, must be equipped to provide primary frequency response. The amount that they're required to provide is a dispatch issue, but this is about being equipped and capable of providing frequency response so they can be called upon if needed. The third finding really is that for a given loss of generation, it is both the system inertia and the timing of the primary frequency response that determines how frequency is arrested. Here I'm showing some examples again with both two different levels of inertia, the red and the blue, but I'm showing a sort of a base case of governor response and an instance of slower governor response with the dashed lines. And you can see that when governor response is slower, it takes much longer for frequency to be arrested. And that's because slower governor response means that less primary frequency response is being delivered, injected into the system over time. And that delays the arrest of frequency. And that can be dangerous if frequency is falling very, very fast. The next set of findings I want to talk about is about the importance of sustaining primary frequency response until secondary frequency control resources can come to support the restoration of frequency. So it is very important that once the frequency has been arrested, that primary frequency response be sustained. If it is not sustained and it is withdrawn for some reason, I'll explain some reasons why that might be the case, then frequency will start to fall again and ultimately cause a blackout. So it's very important to sustain this frequency response. Now, one of the ways in which primary frequency response can be withdrawn is because some power plants are operated with plant load controllers, which, sensing that the power plant has deviated from its operating set point, will seek to restore it to that set point. And so these are examples of different types of turbine generation types, in which showing both the curve indicating when the frequency response is sustained, as well as in the red when the primary frequency response is both initially delivered, but then withdrawn by the operations of supervisorial plant controllers that are trying to restore its output to its original value. This defeats the purpose of arresting frequency and will lead to this fall in frequency because it's not been sustained. This can be corrected very easily by implementing what's called a frequency bias in the plant load controllers, so that they're allowed to operate to where the governors have moved them to when frequency is not at nominal, and then restore this plant load control action once frequency has been restored to the nominal value. The next, I cannot present all the findings, but one I think is very important for those interested in variable renewable generation is that wind can also provide primary frequency response, but it must have headroom. It must be operated at a point which has between the operating point and the maximum capability. Now, wind, as you know, is a taker of what is given to it by the wind, and so typically it is operated without headroom. So recently, manufacturers have introduced a product that is, for lack of a better term, called synthetic inertia, in which power plants, wind generators that do not have headroom, they're operating at maximum capability, are capable of providing frequency response for a very short period of time. And this is about withdrawing inertia power from the wind turbines temporarily. But this power necessarily, as a physical fact, must be restored very, very quickly, and therefore this inertial response cannot be sustained. So it is another example of primary frequency control that is withdrawn and does not sustain, and therefore must be backed up by other forms of primary frequency control that can be sustained until the secondary resources can come into play. So our study really was a large investigation of the conditions of both how much primary frequency control was required and how much it must be sustained. And here's a graph of one of the series of results for a fleet of one type. Across the bottom, I'm showing the fraction of generation. I'm sorry. I'm showing on the vertical axis the fraction of generation that is responsive to frequency. And so this goes from 10% being responsive to frequency to 80% of the fleet being responsive to frequency. And then how much of the fleet of that responsive fraction sustains itself. And this blue area refers to a resting frequency above these set points for under frequency load shedding, which typically around 59.5 in North America. So this shows that combination. So if you have lots of primary frequency response, lots of responding resources, then you can withstand the withdrawal of a certain fraction of those resources, maybe 30% in this example. But if only half of the resources are responding, then you must have much more of it sustaining. Otherwise, frequency will fall below this dangerous point and under frequency load shedding will be triggered. And so again, as the amount of responsive generation decreases, the amount that must be sustained must increase in order to keep the frequency nadir from falling out of this blue zone. Let me close now with the recommendations from our study. Actually, this is one recommendation that I really want to emphasize, and I think it really will be maybe very, very useful for you folks in Korea thinking about some of the evolutions. This is a work that we did to compare frequency control requirements across different countries. And we divided into these two axes that we talked about before. One is interconnection requirements, what the generators must be equipped for versus how they will be dispatched in operations. And so we have situations of increasing stringency in terms of the requirements for interconnection. In the US, very few of our operators had these requirements in place currently. And in fact, at the time my report was written, NERC did not have any such requirements. The first requirement is to sort of require that they have a capability to operate across a specific droop range. And that is what NERC's requirements have moved to as a result of the study that we completed. The next level of stringency is to be both capable of operating across a droop range and operate with a very small deadband, with the mandated deadband around that frequency set point. The final and most stringent set of requirements for generation interconnection are to be tested and verified to perform to these requirements. And you see the countries and power systems that have those requirements. Here on the left, I talk about the dispatch. And so the amount of primary frequency control that is required can be specified as a performance requirement that you must demonstrate that you have after events have taken place, that frequency control has been adequate. You can have requirements that require a spinning reserve requirement for a region within the country. In our area, we call them control areas. And then you can have various ways of procuring these frequency responsive reserves. The intermediate case here are market procured ancillary services. This is where you pay generators to reserve headroom and to have a certain amount of megawatts that are available from their generator that they're not going to dispatch and reserve to be able to provide primary frequency response. You have and then you also have instances in which you both have to reserve the headroom and then you get paid for the amount that you've delivered in particular events. Finally, you can have mandatory participation in which there's no remuneration, in which basically all units are required to be capable of providing of spinning reserve, are capable of providing primary frequency response, and they're obliged to respond in the instance that they are called upon because frequencies deviated too far from nominal. Finally, some of the most stringent requirements in dispatch are where headroom is required to be reserved on the units. And this occurs in Spain and in Italy, in which units are not allowed to sell their entire capacity into the market. They're required to hold some of it off the market to be able to provide this primary frequency response. In some instances, they get compensated. In some instances, they do not. The other recommendations that are studied, I'll go through them very quickly. I know the time is close to being limited. Is that frequency control requires careful study. It needs to maintain information about the capability of the power plants that are being used to provide primary frequency control, as well as the circumstances on which they'll be called to operate. We also recommend, and this is the recommendation that FERC adopted subsequent to our study, that all generators have the capability to provide sustained primary frequency response. So this is now reflected in the generation interconnection requirements in this country. We also recommend that barriers to adding this frequency response to plant load controllers in order to prevent the withdrawal of primary frequency control be evaluated and addressed. Finally, next, we also recognize the ability of non-traditional resources, such as load acting very quickly, or batteries that can inject power very quickly, should be studied and incorporated into the frequency control portfolio that is relied on by operators. Load itself is responsive to frequency, but that load responsiveness is changing due to essentially the introduction of power electronic devices that couple a frequency responsive load and in fact decouple them from the grid. And that is something that is going to lead to increased primary frequency control requirements in the future. And then finally, as I've mentioned, these international practices are good places to look in terms of options for US grid operators to consider. These are the reports that were produced for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They are available on my website, and I commend them to review to learn more about these topics. And with that, I conclude my remarks and thank you again for the opportunity to address you in this conference. I look forward to the discussion that follow. I will stop sharing my screen now